It is really fun. I've seen a crow close up on a radio show that we were doing once, where it was given various problems, and it's a fascinating thing to see how much your gaze changes on an animal when you see displays of intelligence. That from that point onwards, no crow looked to me as it had done, a couple of hours before. Suddenly, that sense of the levels and complexity of cognition means the animal itself, or the bird itself, it seems to almost change in its shape and form.
It's true. And that's why if you spend a lot of time watching animals, this thing will pop out where you see like, oh, they do have intentions. They are engaging in cause and effect. They are doing something that is just like what a human would do. And then you can reframe all of the behavior you've seen before for that animal under this new sort of umbrella of smart and a human-like way. So I've seen that with lots of species, and I think we'll keep studying species and finding more examples of them doing those sorts of things, and all of us will be changing our opinions about what they're capable of.
Now, the next one, in terms of something which seems a very human capability, is, and in fact, anyone who's been watching what's been going on in Westminster today, you probably won't know about it, but we're having the kind of some fun with the former Prime Minister at the moment.
I've seen him. He was very upset. Was he in the? There wasn't. What was the name of it? The gate. The something gate.
Yeah. It's kind of, yeah. There's some pretty
Partygate. Is that it? We know.
That's right. Yeah.
I know it. Yeah.
So many gates. So many. If water had known how many gates it would be making. But the ability to deceive. Because you look at it first of all from the human perspective, and you look at it, you start. In fact, can you tell us? I forget his name now. The guy who basically did a better Ponzi scheme than Ponzi did.
Oh yes, what is the name off of the top of my head? I can't remember. It's in the book.
I've got the book right here. Hang on a minute. I'll just flick to that page. It is. We've got. Oh, where's he gone? Where's he gone? It is. Yes. To be honest, isn't it?
Yes.
Here.
He was from Chicago. Bayou Industry was the name of the thing, but essentially he was operating in the time of Ponzi. Everyone knew about Ponzi at the time, which I found fascinating for this story. And then you had this guy, and he was selling his investors. They would invest in land in South America and give him a bunch of money, and they were all like, "Wow, this is kind of like a Ponzi scheme." But then we trust you because it wouldn't be a Ponzi scheme. Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Ha ha! Everyone had a good laugh. And then it turned out it was a Ponzi scheme, and he was selling property that he did not own in South America. And he knew exactly what he was doing, which was deceiving them and lying to them in a very specific and human-like way, which you have deception in the animal kingdom, but the way we do it is far more complicated, and in this case, quite sinister.
Is it? I mean, it does seem sometimes it can feel quite depressing to see us making the same errors over and over again, that history does repeat itself, that we don't learn from history. And I wondered if is it because sometimes the way the deceit is manufactured is done deliberately to affect us emotionally? So it kind of manages to that thin veneer of our brain, which actually seems to be there at the end of everything, like Oliver Hardy going, well, I told you, that seems to just not have the power sometimes to go, stop for a minute, 60%, you're going to make these huge profits, that the emotional and the desire for that.
I think none of us individually want to believe that we're the person in the statistic, the one that got fooled, because we all think we are different. And that's why we keep playing the lottery, because we think, well, we'll be the one to win. Of course, you're not going to be the one to win. So I think that's what drives us forward. If we have a relationship, I will never believe that you could deceive me, because we're friends and I've already judged your character. So that's different from a hypothetical of two people and being deceptive. So I think our need to have our relationships be real and not full of lies, and we ourselves don't consider ourselves liars or bad people, that is what causes us to be continually deceived and flummoxed by other people.
And then when do we see it in terms of the animal world? Like quite early on, you mentioned Batesian mimicry, which is this wonderful thing where the advantage of looking like something that's toxic or poisonous or deadly, while not actually having to evolve all of those other attributes that are required to be toxic or deadly. So that, you would say, is kind of a natural world level of deceit, but it's not that's basically just through mutation, heredity, and natural selection.
Yes, because that's sort of just baked into the animal. The animal itself doesn't have the vaguest idea that it's being confused for a toxic other animal. It's just going about its business, not being eaten. Good job. So that's standard. So that shows you that within the communication system of the natural world, deception is normal. But then you get into a scenario where the animal is engaging in producing a behavior that itself is deceptive. Like the piping plover pretending to have a broken wing to lead the predator away from its eggs. And so then the question is, well, do they know that they're lying? And then you get into this sort of spectrum of complicated lying, like tactical deception, where you see like the story of the squid in the book, where you have this one sort of subordinate male squid, and it's pretending that it's a female by changing its coloration to fool other male squids into thinking that it's a female, but it's actually on the down low signaling to the females that it wants to mate. And it's tactical because the idea is maybe that squid understands what that other squid is looking at. And so that's when you get into lying, because if I know, or if I'm making guesses as to what you're thinking, because that interests me, that's what humans do, I can then manipulate your thoughts through deception. And so that's where you get this whole spectrum of like having no idea that they're lying to 100% knowing that they're lying because they want something.
Now, I know this isn't a self-help book, but do you feel that perhaps by reading this chapter, the chapter on lying, that somehow it does tool you up with these senses of the different levels that our mind seems to work at? And that by then looking at it across other species as well, that it might give us some armament towards protecting ourselves more?
Yes, I think if you dive into the research and you realize that we, because of our history as an animal that needs to communicate, most of the time are wired to believe, because communication wouldn't work if we were wired to be suspect of signals. And so in your brain is this idea that everything around you is true, that Robin is telling the truth. That's what my brain wants. And if you accept that, then it becomes easier to understand that you will be fooled. Even though you know sometimes the world is unfair, like you have to be aware that you are very likely to be fooled. You could be being fooled right now. And you turn that lens on your own self so that you're more skeptical. I think that's a useful lesson, to accept that you can't think your way into not being deceived, because we're all deceived all the time.
Well, it does seem like it almost does feel innate in human beings, which is sometimes when people are honest, and I don't mean in a mean way. I mean, if you ask someone how they are and they really tell you, and you really listen and you really take an interest, or you're honest sometimes about negative feelings you might have had for yourself, or any of those things, I find that people can be quite surprised that we've not used the social artifice to speed our way through whatever the engagement is.
Yeah, my wife is from the Netherlands. And so I spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, and they are famously blunt people. So if you ask them how they're doing, they will often tell you, and it is unpleasant. And so I think that's fascinating to see that the wheels of society are often greased through lying, through pleasantries at the very least, or just, telling little white lies to make things move faster. And sometimes when you get the Dutch kind of style, things can, they're more contentious, and things will often grind to a halt socially. And so lying is not always bad in that sense. It's part of what we do as a social species, unless you're Dutch.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting, because when I was over in Europe this weekend, someone was going, oh, well, of course, the rudest people, it's actually a Swedish person, said the rudest people are the Swedish. But I don't find them rude. I just find them, again, avoiding the artifice. And if you have enough people in a room who, are Dutch and Swedish, and, we might throw in someone Danish and Norwegian as well. Actually, you've saved a lot of what I would call, time of falsity. You've just gone, oh, we've actually moved on to having proper conversation now.
Oh, I think that's why they've become such great business people, because they don't waste any time. They just go right to the point, and their medical and social systems are very functional because they're just getting to the point. So yeah, it can help in some cases, but like in Sweden, for example, like I spent a fair amount of time there. They're quite famously, and I love this idea. You think of them as cold, because, if you trip and fall, for example, on the ice, a Swedish person might not stop to help you up. But that's because they're being nice, because they don't want to embarrass you by helping you get up when you've tripped and fallen, because they're thinking about you. So a lot of the coldness, I think, in Scandinavia comes from people trying to be nice by not bothering you, which I very much appreciate, I have to say, as a cold-hearted person who probably would not help you up if you fell down.
It just sounds like an alibi for your rudeness, that, to be quite honest. And the fact you've had to write a whole book to get away with the fact you've left so many people lying on the ground is terrible. But there's a lovely, there's an Irish version of that, which is the difference between falling off a bar stool in Dublin and falling off a bar stool in London. That if you fall off the bar stool in London, people just turn and go, "Ha, you fell off the bar stool." And in Dublin, someone turns around and says, "Oh, I did that last week." Which I love. I just think, that way of just reaching out is beautiful.
Yep.
I also, now we're in bars, actually, I'll use this as an awkward media style segue, but drinking as well. Now, this is interesting, which is, one of the things that shows our internal life is that quite often when people are drunk, a lot of, again, the niceties disappear, and a lot of the front, this kind of armament disappears, and we see another side of someone, which means that we are able to start to see the multitudes. And you talk in the book that this is also elephants as well, that we see this.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of pictures on the internet of drunk elephants, like elephants that got into a berry patch and it fermented, and then they got drunk and passed out. And there are countless examples of animals looking for intoxicants, presumably in order to feel drunk or feel very different. And it's always an argument to be used for the existence of consciousness, and that if the animal is seeking mind-altering drugs, the idea is it must have a mind to alter in the first place, which I think is a pretty solid argument. It's actually one of the major arguments for the existence of consciousness in animals. But it is fascinating because why? Yes, some of these release endorphins, and they produce this feeling of euphoria. And I love this idea of, have you heard the drunken monkey hypothesis? Do you know that thing? Where part of the explanation for how humans got to where we are is that we started drinking alcohol a very long time ago around the campfire, got really drunk, and that helped us get rid of all this thinking that we do and just like have sex. So it really greased the wheels of interactions and made us a more social species. And part of our evolution is our need to have had alcohol to shut off the thinky part of our brains, which maybe that's what elephants are on their way toward, getting drunk. Eventually, they're going to invent, rockets.
See, that's interesting, because I'm not sure this is just an early idea, but in terms of some of the cultures where there are arranged marriages are cultures where also there's no tradition, or indeed sometimes religiously you're not allowed to drink alcohol. So I wonder if by removing that, it just meant that there was such an impediment, because as we know, certainly in the UK, the US, and I'm afraid Canada as well, as you said, the wheels of social congress and beyond are very often forged over the fifth pint.
Yeah, and I mean, you have all the data right there. You should publish on that, because that sounds right. And just from having spent time in Sweden, I can say, because they're also, again, very sort of standoffish, a bit cold or whatever. And then in the weekend it comes up and they just get very, very drunk. And then that's when all of the fun things happen. The only way Swedes have managed to mate and create more Swedes is thanks to, I think, alcohol. Sorry, Sweden, but you know what I'm talking about.
Well, we got to sex, so now we'll go straight to death. Which is again this our understanding of death. There's a very interesting idea, which I think I would agree with you, but which is basically about why culture requires death to be something that is imagined and known in the mind of the creator.
Yeah, what's interesting about death is it seems to be knowledge that only humans have. Not that animals don't understand something about death. And there's a great philosopher, Susanna Monceau, who talks about this, and there are others saying there's sort of a spectrum of understanding about what death is. A lot of animals, even insects, might know the difference between a living and a dead thing. That's fine. But then you get to us, and not only do we know what death is, we have this extra ability of knowing that we ourselves will inevitably one day die. And that's a lot of knowledge. That's a pretty big burden, and it's unique to our psychology because we can think about the future. We have an understanding of ourselves as an impermanent thing, and that information really, I mean, there's so many authors who write about this, have created culture and society as we see it, as we're constantly grappling with that knowledge, worrying about our own lives, our own meaning, trying to make things that make us immortal, worrying about our future generations, etc. That's a uniquely human thing to do because of that knowledge.
I think my favorite opening line of any Beckett play is "Birth was the death of him," which I just think is what a whammy line that is. But you talk in the beginning of that chapter about, and I'm going to get the name wrong. I think it's Talika.
Taliqua, the whale.
Yeah. Can you tell us that story again in how that changed our perception of an orca's understanding of death?
Yeah, she was a killer whale living off in the Pacific, northern Pacific, and she had a calf that had died. I think it had been born dead, or at least not long after it had died. And she carried it around on her rostrum, on the top of her head, on her beak, for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. And she wasn't even really eating all that much. She was just carrying this baby up toward the surface. And it certainly seemed like to all the researchers that she was mourning the death of her baby. She was sad about this baby having died. And so that sparked a sort of international dialogue about the nature of grief and mourning, and whether or not animals can grieve and mourn. And there's lots of anecdotes of animals expressing behavior that looks like grief. And so this was just a really powerful example of a very sad, grieving mother whale. Eventually, she let the body go and she went back to normal, and now she's doing okay, as far as I know. But yeah, if an animal can grieve and they have an understanding of death, the question is, like, what does that mean about their psychology? And does that change the way we should be behaving toward them?
Yeah, I find that really, I remember going to Paynton Zoo once and seeing a baboon there. Her baby had died. And again, there was a little warning saying she would be continuing to carry her baby around for a while. So you might be seeing that.
Yeah, the primates show that an awful lot as well. There's the great apes especially. And so then that's why you always associate that with intelligence. Killer whales are the largest dolphin species. They're, so similar to us socially, and then, like we talked about before, and their ability to use symbols. And so the more intelligent species often have these mourning behaviors that we see, which seems to coincide with a more complicated understanding of what death means.
No, I found that's absolutely fascinating, that chapter. I wanted to just talk a little bit more again about our changing perception of animals, because before we started, we were just having a quick chat about Jane Goodall, and I think of how much our understanding of chimpanzees changed just by her work alone. That, by going to Gombe, by being in the forest, by discovering, I think she used to say that she'd always considered that chimpanzees were a little bit better than humans, kind of just in the way they were. And then, of course, she saw incredible levels of brutality, and she saw cannibalism, and she went, I think we might be as bad as each other. But it took her perception and her tenacity to start to change it. So how do you feel over the last century our ability to start interpreting and understanding the complexity of other species' behavior has changed, moved on? What are the new ways that we should see being used more often?
Yeah, certainly in her time period, before she was out and writing about chimpanzees, you had, behaviorism, these ideas in the study of animal minds that they do not have any internal minds whatsoever. They don't think in that sense. They're just sort of, cause and effect reaction machines. And if you were to be a Jane Goodall type of scientist, you would just go out and you'd be recording their behavior, but you do not engage in anthropomorphizing them. You do not think of them as little humans or behaving like humans. Any behavior that you see that's complicated is probably explainable by a more simplistic behavioral explanation cognitively. And she changed that to some extent. She personally, herself, her career, because she would name the chimpanzees, and she would talk about them and describe their behavior in human-like ways. And that was sort of the start of a change in the way that we as scientists were looking at animals. We would then accept that it's possible they do have complicated thoughts or something along the lines of self-awareness or consciousness, and that does explain why they do what they do. So it's been a slow evolution over the past 50 years, moving away from these mechanistic explanations to a more nuanced and more correct understanding of animal minds as being human-like in the sense that they possess a lot of cognitive traits that we never would have thought that they would have had 60 years ago. Complex traits.
And just before